Welcome to the My Lotus Moments Podcast, the podcast for women of color to have open and honest dialogue about experiences that we all share, from dating, relationships, mental health, and everything in between. I'm your host, Hope Coleman, a licensed social worker and mental health advocate and coach. To get more information and resources, visit the website at www.hopeinher.com. Let's get started. Hey guys, welcome back to episode 25 of the My Lotus Moments podcast. As Mental Health Awareness Month comes to a close, I couldn't find a better way to discuss this topic than to bring my girl T-Kea Blackman on the show. Now let me tell y'all about T-Kea. She is a mental health advocate in Washington, D.C., who recently launched her podcast, Fireflies Unite, in January of this year. In less than 6 short months, T-Kea has literally become a force to be reckoned with in the area of mental health awareness. I was so honored to have an opportunity to interview her, not once, but twice. Yes, after having such an amazing first interview, I was devastated later to find out that the audio was pretty much a mess. So I had to cross my fingers in hopes she'd have the time to redo it. And believe it or not, the second interview was just as powerful. We not only talked about mental health awareness in the Black community, but also the role that faith and religion plays in mental health today. I was truly inspired by T-Kea. So be sure to check out her podcast, Fireflies Unite. I'll link her information in the podcast notes. But let me share a little bit more about T-Kea, child. T-Kea Blackman is a mental health advocate, speaker, and writer who lives by the Toni Payne quote, "I'd rather be living my truth happily than living a lie miserably." T-Kea articles have been published in The Mighty, Urban Faith, Blavity, and 2190. Making a digital footprint, her articles have garnered over 50,000 views and encouraged individuals to seek treatment. Described as an inspiration, her heartfelt and powerful story is a testament that you can thrive despite having mental illness. T-Kea was diagnosed with major depression disorder and generalized anxiety disorder and is a survivor of suicide. She previously worked in the television industry as a publicist and production/talent coordinator. Within her career, she provided support to TV1's signature award-winning shows, Unsung and Unsung Hollywood, BET's Black Girls Rock, the Soul Train Awards, and BET X Youth Experience. Her diagnosis led her to use her communications and media skills to raise awareness for mental health within communities of color. She earned her master's degree in public relations and corporate communications from Georgetown University and a bachelor's degree in radio, television, and film production from Howard University. Again, to learn more about T-Kea, check out the podcast notes. Let's get into this discussion.
It's my show, but you are the star. Let's talk about you. Before we get started, just tell people, who you are, what you do, and tell us a little bit about Firefly Podcast.
Sure, absolutely. I would start off with talking about my story. So I would say that I started showing signs of a mental illness probably about the age of 14, but I didn't really say anything. So what that looked like for me was I started having thoughts of suicide, and I would often suppress them, but I really didn't know at that time that it was called suicide. I just knew that I wanted to harm myself, and that I had moments of not wanting to be alive, and I would never say anything to anyone just because that wasn't really something that we talked about. It was just, you just kind of went through life. And so I believe it was triggered by watching my mom be in an abusive relationship. And that was like the worst thing at that time of being 12 years old that I could have experienced. And I just knew that I started to really have this strong hate for my siblings' dad. And then my mom would say oh, well, you got to forgive people and, that whole thing. And so eventually with that, what it did for me was, as a way to cope, I was involved in so much. So I did drill team. I danced. I was in the choir. I did praise dance. did almost everything you can think of: modeling, Girl Scouts. I played an instrument. Like, that meant that if the more I was involved in, that meant I spent less time in the house. And then part of that was also my father. So my father abused drugs. But before he even started abusing drugs, my father actually sold drugs. So I grew up in Elizabeth, New Jersey, low income, or as some people would say, the projects. That's really the type of environment that I grew up in. My father would sell drugs. And then eventually got to the point where he started using them. And so between having the struggles of wanting my father to be in my life and him being absent because of his drug addiction, but then also like selling drugs too, and then like experiencing my mom be abused, that just took a lot. That was just a lot for a child to deal with. But unfortunately, that's the reality of a lot of the kids that I grew up with in my community. Either their father, they didn't know who their father was, or their parents were addicted to drugs, whether it was their mother or their father. And so that just came with a different set of challenges that some kids, they may not have to face. That just brought on to, I guess I would say, maybe triggered, or I guess really allowed me to experience those symptoms of, like, even with having generalized anxiety disorder, I was always worked up all the time. Like, I had no idea that it wasn't normal for somebody to be like, I don't want to say chronically anxious, but like just literally on edge all the time. I didn't know that wasn't normal until, because I remember like being in class one year. I was probably like 13 or 14, and my friend was like, "Why do you worry so much?" And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And then when I was diagnosed, I remember being in the hospital, and the psychiatrist prescribed me some medication. In a couple hours, I was like, "Oh, this is how it feels to like be like mellowed out, like chill." And that's when I realized, like, okay, so there actually is a problem. You actually do have some things that you need to work on. So that's just a bit about, me as far as like my experience. And so eventually got to the point where I went through college, I went through grad school, and I studied production and media and communications. And so that was a bulk of the work that I had done. But I did media as far as like the entertainment portion of it goes. And then when I was about 24 or 25, I had this really bad breakdown to the point where I was thinking about basically killing myself, if we're going to be frank, for about 8 months at a time, and I could not get those thoughts out of my head. So years after suppressing it, and it would kind of come in waves, like it would leave, it would go, and then it would come back, but then eventually I couldn't suppress it anymore. And so I was diagnosed, and then about 8 months later, I had a suicide attempt, and I was forced out of my home into the psychiatric unit, and then that's when this whole mental health journey just kind of started. I always say this, y'all, Beyonce has her beehive, Kia has her fireflies. That's how it. So I wanted to create my own little community. When I was in the darkest place of my life and I did not want to exist, my goal was to die, and it sounds so weird saying it out loud, now. That's really what I wanted. I didn't want to be alive. And so I was in a very dark place. And through being in the hospital and being an impartial hospitalization program, and for those who don't know what that is, it's basically a lot of people, when they get out of inpatient, which is the psychiatric unit, they are transitioned to a partial hospitalization program where they actually get to go home, but they stay in the hospital for about 5 to 7 hours a day and do therapy. And so I did that for about maybe 5 to 6 weeks. And, it was the time where people were in the darkest place of their lives. And not just because of the diagnosis, but because of the stigma. So you automatically feel like you have nobody that you can talk to. You have no one that can relate to you, or people will tell me like, "Girl, ain't nothing wrong with you. You'll be fine. You need to just put on your big girl drawers." That's, people just kind of tell you all these things, and it's like, well, yeah, but I'm not okay, and I'm not fine, and I'm struggling, and I actually want to die. And I remember even a relative saying to me like, "Oh, I thought you was in the hospital because you had cancer." No, but I did try to kill myself. So, and it really just kind of made me feel very isolated, because at that point, it basically diminished what my experience and what my truth was. Because I didn't have cancer and my diagnosis was major depressive and generalized anxiety disorder, then that meant that I should have been okay and I should have been able to just kind of pull it together because it wasn't cancer. And so I was like, I want to create my own tribe of people that we can all relate to each other. And the thing is, some people may go through life and never experience a mental illness, and that's great for them. However, it is also very common that so many of us experience a mental illness and we don't even know that we're dealing with one, or if we do know that we're dealing with it, we just have this shame and that we have to actually work through. And so I said, no, enough is enough. I'm not going to be in this dark place anymore. Like, I'm going to start talking about it. And by talking about something that often makes you feel isolated and left alone in the dark, when you talk about it, you bring it to light. And so that's essentially what the Fireflies do. They come out at night and they use their little lights. And if you have enough of those, we can create a very big light surrounding mental health. And so that's really what, birthed the podcast, because I wanted people to share their stories, people who are battling with any type of mental health condition, to share their story. For someone, particularly people of color, there is a stigma no matter what race or ethnicity you are. But the thing is, for people of color, we have a different set of challenges that we have to deal with. When you think of police brutality, and when you think of we're still battling with the effects of slavery, whether we realize it or not, or whether we want to admit it or not, we just have a different set of challenges that tend to impact our mental health. And so for me, with Christianity and, our faith being ingrained in us for forever, I think it was important that I was able to just kind of be the catalyst and really start that conversation. And I think partly because while there are amazing podcasts, out there, I was looking for something that was for someone of color, but from the perspective of someone who was getting the treatment, not from the person who was treating it. And I was like, no, a social worker or a therapist wouldn't be in business if we weren't getting treated. So where are those people? And so that's what I wanted. I wanted those people to use their story. And even if they weren't directly impacted with the mental illness, like, for instance, I had a young lady who talked about her mom battling schizophrenia. And she talked about what that experience was like for her firsthand, even though she wasn't diagnosed, but that was her mother's story. And that was someone that was very close to her. So what that experience is like for a loved one who's actually helping someone through that time. And so that's really what it was for me. It's just, that's how I intend to bring light into darkness.
So I know this is not our first time speaking, but when we did talk before, I mentioned to you about a recent experience I had with someone who committed suicide. At that time I was competing in a powerlifting competition, and at that particular gym there was a personal trainer who was supposed to compete for the first time in that competition. And he was a young black man, very handsome, maybe around 27 years old. And we had learned at that competition that he had passed away. At the time, they didn't say how, but I just looked at his pictures and I was so intrigued by the fact that they were like, he passed away. And it was still really hard for a lot of people, but I just wanted to know more. I'm like, he didn't look unhealthy. He didn't look like he would be struggling with something that would just take him. He wouldn't even be prepared for a competition if he knew something, if he was sick or something like that. And I asked around, I said, was this all of a sudden, like what was going on? And so I later on found out that he had committed suicide. He was found dead in his car. And they also told me that same day he was found, he was at the gym earlier that day. And he was so excited it was like 3 days before the competition. And he was so excited about the competition. He had bought all matching black and white gear. He was taking a Sharpie to his tennis shoes, his new tennis shoes, and like scratching out the color emblem to make it black. And he was so excited. But later on, they found him dead in his car. And I spoke to someone who was close to him, and they told me that, they used the words, he couldn't come out of that darkness. And I would just like for you to, talk a little bit more about the fact that you birthed this idea of fireflies, and fireflies are used to light up darkness. And what's it like coming out of darkness, if you can maybe explain that?
Wow, Hope, that's a really, really good question. And, I never thought that I would come out. I thought that I would be dead, to be frank. Like that, I thought that I couldn't even see past 5 minutes. When I got to the hospital, I didn't even know what day it was. And I remember them asking me the day or the date, and I told them, and they said, no, that's not right. So that tells you how out of my mind I was. I do remember a lot of things, but there are some things that, I just remember being really not really here mentally. And so I thought that that was my goal. I really wanted to die. So the fact that I'm on the other side, it makes me really emotional because I never thought that I would be here. I never thought that I would even be advocating for mental health. I'm just so shocked. That's why one of the things that I always tell people all the time, that I just didn't see myself here. And so quote unquote, coming out, it's a process. It does not happen overnight. I was diagnosed in 2015. I just started, quote unquote, coming out in 2017. So that tells you the journey and how much work I had to put in therapy. I underestimated the power of therapy prior to actually really getting in there and doing the work. And so people always ask about therapy, and I'll tell them, your therapists don't tell you what to do. They're like a coach. They kind of help guide you through, and they help you identify thought patterns and behaviors, things that you may not see because you're so stuck in your body. And so I didn't realize, for instance, that dark place that I was in was connected to childhood trauma. With me developing generalized anxiety disorder. Now, seeing my mom verbally and physically abused, that was my brain, my body way of responding to what I saw at 12 years old and up until I left at 17 when I graduated from high school. So that was the way that my body responded. That was the way that I dealt with that. And a lot of those behaviors and thought patterns that were very unhealthy, they followed me into adulthood, and so I remember people saying to me, you're always worked up. I never realized that a person being anxious 24/7, that wasn't normal. I had no idea. I thought everybody feels like they're on edge all the time. I didn't realize until one of the things is that I was in the hospital and they gave me medication for my anxiety. And a couple hours later, I was like, yo, this is how it feel to be mellowed out. It just blew my mind. I just had no idea that other people that they may not, granted, everyone has moments of experiencing anxiety, but when it turns into a disorder, that's kind of you're literally like that all the time. And so that was, even just anxiety, experiencing that was a very, a dark moment for me, because I just never thought that my brain would shut down, not being able to sleep. And to the point where you're not really, where you're not eating, or I had moments where I wouldn't eat, the other moments where I would binge eat. It was just, there was no balance in my life. And so when what I would tell people is that, practice grace and compassion with yourself if you are experiencing a mental illness or just really struggling mentally and emotionally, and get the help that you need. It really is a progression. And now that I'm on the other side, looking back to where I was, I can't take all the credit because I have a huge support system, and a support system is so valuable. I realize how blessed and how fortunate I am to have a support system of people who has helped me during the past few years, whether it was financially or whether it was when I could not work anymore and I had to move out of my apartment, just all of those things. And so for now that I'm on the other side, I just honestly feel liberated. That would be the best way that I can put it, because I had the support system. I also did the work in therapy and continue to do the work in therapy, and really figuring out what works for me and what doesn't. And I think sometimes what makes it worse is the comparison thing that we do in our head amongst our peers, especially with the things that we see on social media. And so that also contributes to things such as, developing depression or anxiety. And so
I agree.
Now that I've gotten to a place of owning my truth, I find that I feel, again, very liberated. And that's because of the journey that I had to take and the things that I had to work through in therapy.
Despite a person having a mental illness, they still deal with just life, like the day-to-day stuff that comes along. And so, but you know what, how do I keep myself balanced is one of the two most important things is therapy. So I go to therapy once a week. Shout out to Dr. Tucker. So she is great. My therapist is amazing. And I've been working with her for 2.5 years now. And that is like, my therapy has been vital in my recovery and really managing my mental health. The other part of that is seeing a psychiatrist. So I do see a psychiatrist once a month, and to help with my medication management. While I do have a goal of not needing the medication, I have to wait until I really get to a place where where there's some stability in my life, as far as because now I'm in this stage where I'm transitioning. So that helps as well. The other part of it is doing those things that make me feel really good and fulfilled. So I'm surprised that, I'm just so amazed and proud of myself at the fact of how I basically took something that almost wiped me out and could have wiped me out, and I turned it into this whole platform, this whole business of, promoting mental wellness. And honestly, doing that has been the most fulfilling thing, and that has been really actually helping me manage my mental health, like working on the podcast, writing articles, and speaking at the different conferences, and all of that has been really helpful to me. But with that also comes a different level of pressure, in the sense that now I'm constantly being pulled. Now people are referring to me and saying like, "Oh, Kea, can you, someone just, they're struggling. I think they may be struggling with depression, or someone just tried to kill themselves. Like, can you talk to them?" So now people are kind of reaching out to me and sometimes being a bit pulled too much. And so now it comes with me having to be really guarded in the sense that I can't allow external factors to pull on me so much that I'm drained, and then I become, I experience burnout, and burnout is a trigger for me to go into a depression. And so what I do is, one of the things that I truly enjoy doing is listening to podcasts and reading books. I listen to podcasts and read books more than I watch TV. Just because I can, by nature, I'm an introvert. But I'm not a shy person in that sense. So I love meeting new people. I'm very bubbly. I'm talkative. So the podcast works great for me. So I do love people in that sense, but it's just a matter of how do I get my energy, and I get my energy internally. So that means that I have to shut down. So sometimes that includes taking a social media detox. I'll delete the apps on my phone for some days or maybe a few weeks, and I just spend my time doing something else, because social media could be draining and it could be a trigger. So sometimes I'll just have to shut that and have to shut that down. The other part of that is setting boundaries and saying no. Like when someone will ask me to do something, and it's not that I'm trying to be mean or I don't want to help them. It's just that in order for me to stay mentally sane and to be healthy, I have to say, I can't do this right now, And so that what has been truly helping me is doing those things. What are those things that make me feel balanced? What are those things that make me feel whole, that make me feel fulfilled? And part of that is doing those things. So it can get sometimes a lot, in the sense that now that I'm in mental health basically 24/7 because of my own experiences and because of the work that I'm doing,
that I'm also very committed to saying that you will not hear me say anything on my podcast or speaking at an event and suggesting something to someone and I'm not living it. I take my downtime and my me time, I take it very seriously when it's time for me to pull away and kind of be to myself. By nature, lately, by nature, I have been to myself because I'm really committed to, growing the podcast and growing my business and being an entrepreneur, that lately I've just been spending so much time with myself because I want to have a successful business. But that also comes with, like I said, doing those things. The other part of that is me wanting to add more into my spirituality and my faith and my relationship with God. So when I get up in the morning, I pray, I journal, and I read a devotional and, talk to God. And I have that moment. And with what I've been really working on is creating a morning ritual. So for me, that is setting the tone for my day, opposed to just getting up and eating breakfast and getting dressed and just kind of start moving around. Have a moment to actually just sit still and sit with whatever you're dealing with, whether it's maybe you are feeling good and nothing is going on, but still having a moment to actually still sit in peace and quiet. And for some people, maybe it may not, maybe they don't identify as a Christian, but maybe it's meditating for them. Maybe it's mantras, whatever it is that can actually help you set the tone for your day. Because I know how it feels to get up in the morning and then just start running around. And then you feel kind of really frazzled throughout the day. And so for me, that's one of the things that I've been working on, is creating a morning ritual. And another part of that is what I've been working on adding is just exercise to my day, even if it's just for going for a walk. But I'm really trying to find those things that make me feel good. And so even with exercising, I'm I have to find something that I enjoy doing, because I don't want exercise to feel like a chore. If I find something that I enjoy doing, then it doesn't feel like another thing that I have to do. And so literally I have made a conscious effort to make my mental health a priority, so that I don't have a point of, kind of reverting back. And I think now with being immersed into my friend's family, this is the space, the time in my life where I've been creating, because after you're diagnosed with a mental disorder, you kind of have to create a new way of living, because what worked for you in the past no longer can serve you, because if it was healthy and if it was good for you, then you would not have had a breakdown. And so for me, I had to figure out what will be my new norm. And so I had to, and a part of that is not comparing myself to what my peers are doing, because with my peers who may not be dealing with the mental illness, we don't have the triggers that I have. They don't have certain things that I have to be cautious about. So I have to be comfortable in my truth and whatever that is. So I hope I answered that question. That was kind of long.
Another thing I want to talk to you about is that you talked about in high school how you were always worked up. But you graduated from the Black Mecca, from Howard University, which I was
Hey.
And you also graduated from Georgetown? Girl, you just do it big, right? So how did you manage your anxiety during your college years?
I wasn't managing it well. So, no. So I honestly really didn't get serious with treatment until after I graduated with my master's. So when I was in undergrad at Howard University, I was doing fantastic academically. I was starting organizations on campus. I was on these, in leadership, and I was doing academically. I was doing great, but mentally and emotionally, I was certainly struggling. I would have moments of being suicidal in college, but of course, that's a very unhealthy way of trying to deal, is basically keep yourself so busy to the point where you don't necessarily think. And I didn't realize that that's what I was doing, but I did a very poor job. I was not taking care of my mental health at all. In undergrad and graduate school, I started going to, actually, you know what? I will give myself a little bit of credit, because I also was dealing with a lot of grief. I've had quite a few people pass away during my undergraduate years. And so I started going to see a therapist who was actually really good. she also encouraged me to be involved in like a group dealing with grief. And it was basically a group of college students who was struggling with grief, and it was great. And I went through all of that, and I started but I didn't really tell anyone I was going. It was just, I don't even think I told my mom, honestly. Yeah, I didn't tell anyone. I just was going, and I kind of found it to be a bit helpful. And then when I got to graduate school, I did see a counselor at Georgetown, but I don't think I got any work done. And at that time with her, and I wasn't even diagnosed. I think I was going through a phase in my life in graduate school where I was, of course, I'm pretty sure I was dealing with depression and anxiety. But when I went to her, I just basically said I was struggling because I kind of was in that phase of, like comparing myself to my peers and not feeling like I was as far along as I should be. I was like, that whole thing, so I think and then I was also feeling like I was behind in the sense of like all of my friends were dating and I wasn't dating, and like so that was the kind of things that it was like, I don't want to call them surface level, but to me, I mean, dealing with things that were much more severe, that was kind of like surface level to me. And so honestly, I wasn't diagnosed, and so I really wasn't dealing with it, I guess, as best as I could have. And so I really didn't start getting serious about my mental health until being forced into the hospital by the police.
I know there's one thing you almost kind of touched on, and I really want to talk about the fact, and you just did a podcast on this. How do you address those people who may be struggling with their mental health, but also very grounded in their faith and their religion? How would you address, or what can you tell someone who's really struggling with their mental health while also trying to remain faithful to God and their religion? And those two seem to conflict sometimes.
Oh, yeah. And you know what? That's actually a very huge trigger for me. Like, not talking about it, obviously. Talking about it doesn't trigger me. But what does trigger me is if I see someone telling someone, like, they need to pray harder, or it's because of they don't have their faith would, if they had stronger faith, then they wouldn't be experiencing this mental illness, or if it's because of sin or whatever those things that people tell someone. And I do think that the church is really coming around now to talk about mental health more. I do see more things, initiatives and ministries that the church is doing to help educate on mental health. But for me, someone told me to talk in tongues for 20 minutes a day. And this person loved me and cared about me, but I just realized that it was a lack of education and knowledge on what depression is. And so, like I said, if I got to the point where I wasn't showering and I wasn't cooking and I wasn't getting out of bed, for one, I didn't know how to talk in tongues, and I didn't have the energy to talk in tongues. I was barely talking at all. And so I think one of the things that for the person who is struggling with their faith, it is very hard, because like, I remember just reading a devotional a couple weeks ago, and it was talking about anxiety, and I felt conflicted. I felt convicted, and I was like, wait, hold up. Why do I feel bad about this? I have a disorder. Like if someone was reading, that wouldn't be someone's same response if a person had cancer, like pray harder, it'll be more so like, oh, I'm praying for your healing, and that, you're going to get through this. And even though people can be, it's just like we have this double standard, I guess, in the church, like what we decide to accept as quote unquote normal illnesses, or what may not be normal. It's like with the mental illness, people say like, oh, that's of the devil, or whatever things that they may say. And that will push people away from the church. For a very long time, I would not step foot in the church after the person told me to talk in tongues. Like, I didn't want to read the Bible. I wasn't praying. I didn't want to listen to gospel music. I was angry with God. Like, and so I had to get to the point and realize, like, my spirituality and my faith in God, or my religion, is something that is very important to me. But what I had to do was seek God and have a relationship with God for myself. And I'm working to a place to work on my spirituality and my relationship individually. and strengthening my relationship, but then also strengthening myself mentally. So that way, if I do happen to run into someone who may say something out of ignorance, then one, I could check them, but then two, it's more so just educating that person and telling them like, that's not true. And if they, whether they choose to believe it or not, I can't take their stuff as my own, because a person who is a representation of God, and then if you feel like they hurt you, it will push you away. And so one of the things that I have done is like, I'm not like a member of a church at this time. I decided that I will do, my devotionals every morning on my own. This morning, I did my devotional and I listened to a sermon and I prayed, and I'm working on myself to figure out, I have to define my relationship with God for myself and not allow someone in the church to tell me what my relationship with God should look like. So I think that's what it is, because a lot of times with church, it could be a lot of politics in the church, and like sometimes people with religion, it's a lot of practices and customs and rituals that people do, and those rituals a lot of times or customs can be, or sometimes they are man-made. But when you think of a person's relationship with God, that has to be defined for themselves, and that's not something that someone can do for you. And so that is truly what has helped me. And so now when I do go back to joining the church, one, it will be a church that is doing something already with mental health. So that way I know that part of me will feel nourished. And because at the end of the day, your faith could be something that could be be a great support for your mental health. But if the people in the church are not or uneducated, then it can work against it. And so that would be probably one of my, my biggest piece of advice is, people have to define their relationship for themselves. But if they are struggling mentally and they may be going through a depression, that they also get the help that they need. And, Patrice Douglas on, I don't know if you know her, but she's on social media, and she has her T-shirts that says you can pray and see a therapist at the same time. And that's exactly what I do. I pray and I see my therapist at the same time. Like, you wouldn't say in the church, like if I fall down the stairs and break my leg, you're not going to say talk in tongues for 20 minutes. What's your response going to be? Oh, you should probably go to the doctor because you need an x-ray to make sure that your bones aren't broken. Like, and if it is, you need a cast, and then you'll say, I'm praying for your recovery and for your healing. But as soon as it has something to do with the mind, the person, it's like they almost attack the person's faith or their character. Yeah. So that's something that we have to really pull away from. And that's why, like, I've been doing things like speaking at church conferences and really sharing my story and just letting people know, coming from a place of compassion and love, because I find if we get really defensive and kind of point the finger, then they're going to be closed off and not want to receive it. But just really educating them and letting them know that, I understand that, most people, they genuinely want to help and their heart is in the right place. But you can't help someone if you don't have any knowledge on it. And so I think one of the things that the church can do is at the very basic level, is get training in mental health first aid. Like everyone in, the pastor, anyone who serves in leadership, who are constantly working with people, because even people typically when they are in crisis, they do run to the church. So people, or even if they have a ministry, mental health ministry that includes actually licensed clinicians, not people who are not trained, actually people who are trained, and so they can get the help that they need. There is a church, and even in Maryland, they actually have a mental health facility like on the church's campus. And so I think the more we start to talk about it and make people feel comfortable, they will start to get to a point of not just being educated on it, but not taking it on as this is something I'm getting this because I've sinned, or this means that I'm not praying harder or I'm not fasting enough. And so I think that's really the ways that we can kind of combat that.
I definitely agree. This is the perfect time for churches to make space for mental health and to create a safe space for those who are seeking mental health services. I do believe more people will come to the realization or the acknowledgement that they may need some assistance with whatever they're dealing with if churches had mental health advocates or professionals in the church. Because you're right, when you go through a crisis, you do go to church. And I know for myself, when I was at one of my lowest points, I know I had plenty, but one, I was running to church faithfully and crying and praying that God, well, whatever was on my heart would take that away from me. And I would go back home and I would feel the same emptiness and burden, you know? So it's like, it took me a year, I believe, to even go see a therapist. And I'm like, I prayed about this. Like, I submitted this issue with God, and yet I still feel this burden. Like, how do I live? So it's almost like when you do things like that, you almost feel as though you failed because whatever it is that God gave to you, you can't handle it, right? Or, well, maybe I'm not praying the right prayer. Maybe I'm not praying hard enough, like you said, or praying enough. Like, what is it that I should be doing to ease my mind of the worry that I have or the PTSD I'm dealing with, you know? So if there was someone in that space that was willing, and just like you said, not just someone who can, you know, try to pray you out of it, but somebody who will really sit down with you and help you process those emotions in the church, I think more people will use that resource. I believe older people now, I believe because they may or may not still be on the fence about mental health services, but if they was in the church, I guarantee you it would be more. They would utilize it more.
One of the things too is like, what is a person in the instance? We know that there are instances where some people not everyone, but some people who are dealing with the mental illness, they may actually deal with that for the rest of their lives. And so what do you do when prayer isn't enough and talking in tongues and, you know, jumping up and down? And what do you do when all of that stuff, you still going home and you still, for instance, maybe hearing voices and seeing things that aren't there, and you're diagnosed with schizophrenia? What do you do? Like, do you keep telling that person to pray? Do you tell them they're crazy, or do you tell them get those demons out of you? Like, so that's why those things are so important. And I remember I interviewed a pastor who has bipolar disorder, and she said, if a person forgets to take their medication for diabetes and they happen to die, would you tell them they're going to hell? But because someone was actually ill and their illness caused them to feel like the only option was to die, then you tell them they're going to go to hell. Like, and then what if someone is coming to the church who may be very new and they're not even saved, but they just know, maybe they feel the need to run to the church because they feel like that's the best thing to do, and they're not actually technically a believer or saved, and you tell them they're going to go to hell and they don't even believe in hell. You know, like it just could be so, it's just, you know, education that has to be done. But I do think that, you know, we are getting to a better place. And again, if people at least have the bare minimum of being trained in mental health first aid, I think it can really help them. And even churches maybe just having like a referral program and saying like, okay, well, we can't help you here because we're not trained, but here's a list of mental health professionals where you can help. Or maybe they have a contract with a licensed clinician, and a licensed clinician comes in and does counseling sessions a couple times a week. There's so many ways that we can integrate in mental health.
I do want to say one thing before we end this conversation in regards to, you know, faith and religion and mental health. Even outside of the church, when you work with people individually who were raised in the church, you know, and they may be at a crossroads where, you know, I'm trying to figure out my own individual relationship with God versus what I've been taught and what's been embedded in me. And when you throw in the whole mental health thing, you know, even I had somebody on Facebook maybe a week ago reach out on Facebook and say, I need serious mental health help. And so I told her the steps of what to do. But there were people that was coming and saying, just pray about it, girl. You need to find you a good church. And I'm like, that does not. God provided us with resources, you know. God gave us people who was willing to be educated in the things that we need help in. We have to utilize God's resources to be better and not act as though these things don't exist and God didn't place these people in our lives, you know?
Absolutely. And I always say I believe that God worked through my therapist and my psychiatrist. You know, like there are other people that God can also work through.
Exactly. And just like me, I know my purpose is doing what I'm doing. So you can't say that God isn't using me in the mental health field. And if he's using me, then there's got to be some people on the other end that I need to be a vessel for, right? So I think people don't make that connection.
That's the one that I'm really passionate about, and it does trigger me at times. And even I was actually at a mental health conference last weekend, and they were talking about it, and I literally started crying, and that's how I knew that it was still a soft spot for me. You know, like I was like, wow, you know, like I was really hurt, you know, and I knew it wasn't their intention, but at the time I was really angry, you know, and so now I'm working on my faith, and, you know, I'm asking God to open doors so I can be in positions where I'm educating people on, you know, to be very mindful and considerate about the things that they say, because it could be the very thing that sets someone over the edge.
You're right. Well, Kia, we have talked long enough, and I know you have so many other things to do, but before you go, can you tell everybody out there what you have coming up next, how people can get in contact with you? Just share with everybody how they can reach you.
Yes. So on Instagram and Twitter, I am at Fireflies Pod, FIREFLIES Pod, which is short for podcast, POD. So you can get me on Instagram and Twitter. And then on Facebook, you can just search my name, T-Kea Blackman. And then we also have I'm working to build the group and really trying to find ways to make it more engaging. The Fireflies Unite Healthy Minds group. The things that I have coming up, I have quite a few things coming up. I have a speaking engagement in Baltimore, which will be the Turn the Light On conference, which is a faith conference about mental health, and is actually by a licensed clinician who is a minister. So I'm super excited to be a part of that. And then I also have my own event. My very first Fireflies Unite event will be July 21st. And it is to tackle suicide and, you know, mental health for Black and Latino children. And so that it will be in Maryland, and it's called Save Our Babies, a heart-to-heart about suicide and mental health for children of color. And so those are the two things that I have coming up. And then if anyone is in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, I am actually the lead producer for This Is My Brave. We will be hosting auditions in the month of June for anyone who has a mental illness and would like to share their story through song or through dance or through comedy or through essay. They can share their stories that way. And so if anyone is interested in sharing their story on a stage of about 300 plus people, they can feel free to audition. And so they can also reach out to me to obtain that information as well. So those are the things that I have coming up.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for talking to us. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the My Lotus Moments podcast with Hope. If you enjoyed this episode, share the Apple Podcast with a friend or someone you know who needs it. And please take a few minutes to rate and review the show, because that is how other people find us. And if you're talking about this episode online, don't forget to use the hashtag MyLotusMoments and tag me at JustMoreHope on Instagram and Twitter. Until next time, thanks for listening.